I'm Kari Rowe, and you're listening to the Foreign Saints Podcast, a pulse check for those who die daily, a show committed to the spiritual and social vision of Jesus Christ. And today is about the social vision part of that statement. The spiritual vision of Christ, aka theology, is not supposed to be trapped in our heads. It impacts not only how we interact with culture, but also the kind of culture we as disciples of Jesus create and endorse with our lives. And so to that end, as you could maybe guess from the title, we're going to be talking about IVF, in vitro fertilization. We're going to be talking about what it is, medically, scientifically, what is IVF, how is it performed, what does it do? Secondly, what in the heck was the Alabama Supreme Court's ruling really about? And lastly, we will be asking the question, how does Scripture inform our culture of family planning and IVF specifically? For those of you that have been diligently following this podcast, you'll know that we are in the middle of our verse-by-verse walk through the Gospel of Matthew. And in the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about what it means to be a city on the hill, what it means to not be hypocritical, and what it means to be using your money and finances for the purposes of kingdom growth instead of to build your own kingdom down here. And all of those concepts and more are going to play themselves out in our in this little survey, in this discussion of IVF and Scripture today, right? So again, all of that theology we've been talking, we're going to be applying it to real life situations as well on this podcast, right? Or else, what is the point of theology? And so first things first, as I've said in other episodes on this podcast, the disciple of Christ has to be about truth, okay? If we claim to worship the way, the truth, and the life, then we have to care about being diligent to do the work of being truthful and factual in what we talk about. So before we talk opinions on IVF, we're going to be getting into the science of what it is. All right, so what is IVF? All right, IVF stands for in vitro fertilization, and that phrase, in the in vitro part, is Latin for in glass, right? So it's fertilization in glass, right, outside of the body, our artificial environment, right? But according to Dr. Eve Feinberg, who is the Associate Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, she defines in vitro fertilization as the process of joining a woman's egg, their ovum, and the husband's sperm in a lab rather than in the woman's body. The living embryo that is created in that process is then implanted into the woman's womb, sometimes after an extrauterine period of growth. All right. So they combine the genetic material, they create a unicellular, embryo, and they'll usually, grow it, gestate it, whatever, for 5 or 6 days, outside the womb before attempting an implantation. Things that I learned in researching this. This procedure was created in the 1970s for a woman with blocked fallopian tubes. All right, so this procedure has been around since the 70s, and at this time, according to Dr. Zev Williams, director of the Columbia University Fertility Clinic, about 2% of U.S. births, so approximately 8 million people, are born as a result of an in vitro fertilization procedure. According to Dr. Mamie McLean, infertility specialist at Alabama Fertility at Birmingham, Alabama, women take an 8 to 10 day regimen of fertility injections containing hormones that help mature the woman's ovum, that help mature their eggs, right? And then those eggs are retrieved, in an in or outpatient setting, so that way they can be, fertilized in vitro. And these were some interesting numbers to me that I think are rather relevant to the discussion. According to Feinberg, right, the expert that gives us our definition of IVF, according to her, in her experience of doing this, she says if you take 10 eggs and expose them to sperm, 7 of those 10 will fertilize, usually, right? 7 of them will be fertilized. 25 to 50% of those will get to the blastocyst stage of maturity, which is 5 to 6 days after fertilization. So 5 to 6 days after, after the sperm and egg meet, you're at the blastocyst stage of development. And depending on patient age and along with other factors, 10 to 60% of that smaller number will become a baby. So just to put that in terms of numbers that actually make sense to us, I'm going to keep all the ratios the same, but instead of say 10 eggs, I'm going to say 1,000 eggs, just to make the math a little easier to conceptualize, right? So if you take 1,000 eggs and expose them to sperm, using Feinberg's ratios, 700 of those 1,000 eggs will successfully be fertilized, right? And so you got to understand, from the scientific and Christian perspective, once that sperm and egg meet, you have yourself a new human being, all right? New genetic material that is not moms or dads. You're not talking about a parasite, because parasites are not the same species as their host. You know what I'm saying? Parasites are not offspring of the host, right? So you're talking out of 1,000 eggs exposed to sperm, roughly 700 will fertilize. So now we have 700 unique human beings that at that moment bear the image of God, that at that moment are being created after the image of their creator, right? Sure, they don't look like you and me just yet, right? But they've got everything that they're going to need to grow up into their full potential, as long as someone doesn't come along and, muck in the sauce. Now, of that 700 number that are fertilized, remember, she said 25 to 50% will get to the blastocyst stage of maturity, which is 5 to 6 days. So apply that to the number 700. You're talking about 175 to 350 real live human beings, real live children, real live infants, babies, whatever you want to call them, right? 175 to 350 out of 700 will survive the week. And of that number, 10 to 60% will actually make it to term, right? So you're taking that 175 to 350 range. On the low end, you're talking 18 to 105, between 35 and 210, right? So you're talking 18 at the low end of 10%, and 210 at the high end of 60 will become a baby, depending on patient age and other factors. And remember, we started with 700 fertilized eggs. We started with 700 fetuses, 700 image bearers of God. But if you had your 1,000, then you're whittled down to maybe 18, maybe 210, right? Do you get the sense this is a wasteful process when it comes to human life? Because it is, all right? And the usual method for in vitro fertilization is to harvest multiple eggs at a time, right? Harvest multiple matured ovum from the mother at a time, and then to attempt fertilization. Right, to attempt fertilization, right? That's why Feinberg's numbers were 10 eggs and 7, right? Because you're mass fertilizing eggs, and then you're going to study those eggs. You're going to study those fetuses, those embryos, for genetic abnormalities. You're going to study them. I know people don't want to admit to this, but you could, and no doubt, and a lot of places do, study them for desired or undesired physical traits. In March 31st of 2022, T2T, telomere to telomere, which is a biology joke for those of you in the know, was a group that filled in the gaps left by the Human Genome Project in April 2003, and produced the first truly complete human genome sequence, right? So we have the technology. We've had the technology for a couple of years now to be able to look at the DNA sequences of IVF embryos that we create to allow parents to pick the best of the litter, as it were, and leave the rest on ice. And multiple frozen embryos seems to be an unavoidable byproduct of effective IVF treatment. Because again, to people that would, say, oh, to Christians that may say, and we'll be getting into that later on, that may say that IVF is safe and acceptable if you're going one egg at a time. Well, if that were a viable option for the couple, they probably wouldn't need to go IVF in the first place, right? The reason you go with mass fertilization is to increase your chances, and so you can pick the best of the litter. That's the entire idea. A lot of people don't know this, but there are tons. There is a staggering amount of frozen embryos, of frozen fetuses in labs collecting dust around the country right now. You can look it up. There is a lady who adopted one of these fetuses, and technically the fetus is older than her. Fetus has been around since the 80s or 90s or something like that, and she adopted it here recently to give it a chance at life, because kids just been sitting on ice for decades. Right? And not all of them survive it. And that brings us to our second, to our second question, right? That's the science of IVF. That's what it is. Now we're going to talk about the Alabama Supreme Court ruling. What was that about? Well, the situation they were opining on is that between 2013 and 2016, three families, three parents, I guess, three parental couples, the LePages, the Fawns, and the Asines. They were parents of embryonic kids that died when a patient entered the cryo nursery of the facility and accidentally dropped their containers on the ground, shattering them. And let me go over here, get to my laptop, and let me just check and see the switching tab. Yep. I've got the court opinion queued up right here. And for those of you that don't know, you can look up formal court opinions. All right, this is a 131-page document from the Supreme Court of Alabama. Man, it's a long name for a case. So summarizing, the LePages, individually and as parents and next friends of two deceased LePage embryos, and William and the Fawns, individually and as parents and next friends of two deceased Fawn embryos, versus the Center for Reproductive Medicine, PC and Mobile Infirmary Association, right? So I know a lot of gobbledygook long names on both sides, but that is the name of this particular case. And so coming down to page 5 of the document, actually we've got the time. We've got the time for me to set the stage here, and this thing reads really well as well. So let's see here. The plaintiffs in these consolidated appeals are the parents of several embryonic children, each of whom was created through in vitro fertilization and, until the incident giving rise to these cases, had been kept alive in a cryogenic nursery while they awaited implantation. James LePage and Emily LePage are the parents of 2 embryos whom they call embryo A and embryo B. William Tripp Fond and Carolyn Fond are the parents of 2 other embryos called embryo C and embryo D, and Felicia Burdick Acine and Scott Acine are the parents of 1 embryo called baby Acine. Now, between 2013 and 2016, each set of parents went to a fertility clinic operated by the Center for Reproductive Medicine to undergo IVF treatments. During those treatments, doctors are able to help the plaintiffs conceive children by joining the mother's eggs and the father's sperm in vitro, that is outside the mother's body, right? It's all stuff we've just been talking about on this podcast. The center artificially gestated each embryo to a few days of age, right? That 5 to 6 day that we were talking about to get to that blastocyst stage of development, and then placed the embryos in the center's cryogenic nursery, which is a facility designed to keep extrauterine embryos alive at a fixed stage of development by preserving them at an extremely low temperature. The parties agree that if properly safeguarded, an embryo can remain alive in a cryogenic nursery indefinitely, several decades, perhaps longer. The plaintiff's IVF treatments led to the creation of several embryos, some of which were implanted and resulted in the births of healthy babies. The plaintiffs contracted to have their remaining embryos kept in the center's cryogenic nursery, which was located within the same building as the local hospital. The plaintiffs alleged that the center was obligated to keep the cryogenic nursery secured and monitored at all times. But in December 2020, a patient at the hospital managed to wander into the center's fertility clinic through an unsecured doorway. The patient then entered the cryogenic nursery and removed several embryos. The sub-zero temperatures at which the embryos had been stored freeze-burned the patient's hand, causing the patient to drop the embryos on the floor, killing them. Right? So that is the situation. That's the situation that has engendered this entire situation. Right? Patient walks into the cryogenic nursery, gets his hand freeze burned and drops the little baby's containers, shattering them, and they die. Right? Let me see, maybe make sure I'm at page 5 here. Yes, I am. The plaintiffs, they brought 2 lawsuits against the center and the association. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but suffice to say that they asserted their claims under Alabama's wrongful death of a minor act. But they did it in a weird way to me, because the plaintiffs would specify, later on in this report it makes clear that they specified that their common law claims were pleaded in the alternative, and quote, only apply should the courts of this state or the United States Supreme Court ultimately rule that an extrauterine embryo is not a minor child, but is instead property, unquote. Right? And this to me really sounds like 3/5 compromise level of having it both ways. You're coming at the center, technically speaking, for the wrongful death of a minor because that's the act that they're invoking, but it sounds to me like they're also trying to say that they're legally not a minor, not a person. Like I said, just it smacks of hypocrisy to me. It's like, are they people or are they not? Right? They're property until emotional duress comes in which case then they're people again. It's just, it seems all very confused as far as the logic goes. Luckily for us, the Alabama Supreme Court was the one to have to wade through all of that. And so we get to read their analysis here. And again, just kind of going to let the court speak for the court itself, because these guys are sharp. Okay, these guys are sharp, and this is what they said in their analysis section on page 7 of the opinion. The parties to these cases have raised many difficult questions, including ones about the ethical status of extrauterine children, the application of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution to such children, and the public policy implications of treating extrauterine children as human beings. Tuck that one away, listeners. We will be mentioning more about that, public policy implications. But the court today need not address these questions because, as explained below, the relevant statutory text is clear. The Wrongful Death of a Minor Act applies on its face to all unborn children without limitation. So catch that, right? The Alabama Supreme Court has made the situation quite clear for us lay people, right? The question is whether or not the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act applies to extrauterine children. Their conclusion is that it does, and that it has no limits. Like I said, you can Google this if you want to and read everything that's here. I will be jumping ahead to page 11 of the opinion because there are things starting there that I think are relevant. To us, right? This is where they talk about the text of the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act applying to all children without exception. Now, why am I making such a big deal about this? Again, like I said, I'm trying on this podcast to demonstrate healthy research habits, right? Because again, people are losing their freaking mind over this case. Right? And all sorts of crazy narratives are floating over the TV, over the over the cable news, over social media platforms, right? And so how does the disciple of Christ wade through all of this nonsense to get to some good information? And I think there are some principles that the Bible gives us that can be applied to research to keep you safe, to keep you from falling into pitfalls of false news on every side of the aisle, right? It's not just blue Democrats that are giving you false news. You got false news coming out of red Republicanism too, which we will be getting to here shortly, right? But I decided, I was like, look, I know that courts give public opinions on things that are readable. So why not, instead of listening to cats like Whoopi Goldberg on The View or angry people on TikTok, why don't I just read the court opinion and see what I have to think about it for myself, right? So again, there's interesting factoids in here. So I mean, I'm gonna read it because I think it's interesting to me, and people that are willing to listen this long, I think, would be willing to hear this as well. But like I said, page 11 of the opinion. First enacted in 1872, the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act allows the parents of a deceased child to bring a claim seeking punitive damages, quote, when the death of a minor child is caused by the wrongful act, omission, or negligence of any person, unquote, provided that they do so within 6 months of the child's passing. The act does not define either child or minor child, but this court held in Mack versus Cormack in 2011 that an unborn child qualifies as a minor child under the act, regardless of that child's viability or stage of development. We reaffirmed that conclusion in Hamilton v. Scott in 2012, explaining that Alabama's wrongful death statute allows an action to be brought for the wrongful death of any unborn child. None of the parties before us contest the holdings in Mack and Hamilton, and for good reason. The ordinary meaning of child includes children who have not yet been born. This court's most cited dictionary defines child as an unborn or recently born person, citing Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. And all other mainstream dictionaries are in accord. See the Oxford English Dictionary, defining child as an unborn or newly born human being, fetus, infant. See Webster's Third New International Dictionary, defining child as an unborn or recently born human being. There is simply no patent or latent ambiguity in the word child. It is not a term of art and contains no inherent uncertainty. Wow. Wow, oh wow. These guys came to play with their research, guys. The parties have given us no reason to doubt that the same was true in 1872, when the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act first became law. Indeed, the leading dictionary of that time defined the word child as, quote, the immediate progeny of parents, unquote, and indicated that this term encompassed children in the womb. Wow. Wow. In Blackstone's commentaries, the leading authority on the common law expressly grouped the rights of unborn children with the rights of persons, consistently described unborn children as infants or children, and spoke of such children as sharing in the same right to life that is, quote, inherent by nature in every individual, citing William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. Right? And that's incredible, man. That's incredible to me. Just again, the amount of citative work that has to be done if you're a Supreme Court justice is rather humbling to me, right? But again, this is the sort of content that you get from, you know, people that are actually trying to have an educated conversation about the topic instead of just trying to spit angry vitriol and selfishness at you. But it does at least say to me that our present day culture of death is the crazy one, right? Because at least in Alabama, if not other parts of the country, the obvious truth was legally held for a few centuries, that unborn children are children. Now, I'm not saying that Alabama's perfect, right? I'm not saying that. You know, there's all sorts of sin in our nation's history, and Alabama has definitely been a state that has perpetrated quite a lot of that sin. You know, racism, segregation, you know, chauvinism and misogyny. But on this point, they are correct, right? That unborn children are children. And I think the thing that this entire case touches on and exposes is how in our culture with IVF and surrogacy and you know, and abortion and all these other things, that children become more and more commodities and property, an extension of a person's, in my opinion, I would, it's like I said, in my view, a person's entitled pride of life, just an extension of that sin mentioned in 1 John 1, the pride of life, right? There are those that justify sinful means for apparently righteous gain. But God will judge the intentions of the heart on the day the elements melt like ice before a risen sun. God will avenge the frozen corpses sacrificed to your self-esteem, right? That day is coming. That day is coming when God will expose the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And on that day, those babies will have their justice done for them. But it's at this moment that I'd like to jump on over to Ground News. All right, you've probably heard me mention them before. They're a news aggregation site. They don't write news articles of their own. They're a hub that pulls in a bunch of news and allows you to kind of see the news from a bird's eye perspective and see different biases and leanings and blind spots and all sorts of great stuff. They work off of subscription, off of paid subscription, which means that, yeah, not so easily swayed, not so easily bought. And so I was doing my research again, using Ground News, and they've got the story here. Alabama health system pauses IVF treatments after court embryo ruling. I'm certain that at least some of you listening to this episode know about that. That their health system paused IVF treatments because of this ruling, which I think is very, very interesting. Their artificial intelligence on Ground News has grabbed 166 different news articles about this topic and separated them into political affiliations, left, center, and right-leaning. And one of the first titles that comes up in their little article listings is from the NC Register, the North Carolina Register, I believe, a right-leaning, kind of a low factuality, paper news source. Their title says, after Alabama Supreme Court's embryo personhood ruling, what comes next? Which I think is just absolutely wild. That this is a question that needs to be asked. From, what is this, WION, a mixed factuality center leaned source. Headline: Donald Trump extends support to IVF treatment after Alabama ruling. U.S. former President Donald Trump on Friday said that he supports IVF treatment as he joined the list of Republicans who have distanced themselves from a ruling given by an Alabama court over the issue. Just absolutely wild to me that Trump would come to, that Donald Trump would come to their defense. But like I said, right, like, as I've pointed out many times before, it's things like this, which is why I don't identify as a Republican, right? I am a Christian that is after the kingdom of Christ, right? I want to see the kingdom come to this earth. I want to see it done on earth as it is done in heaven, as it will be done in the kingdom, right? But one of the reasons I like ground news is that you can see the bias insights, right? I can click left, center, and right, and I can see, the algorithm looks through all of the different articles and kind of brings to you the different emphases of the different, political slices that you've got. So according to the ground news AI, the political left emphasizes the concerns for IVF providers and attributes the restrictions to Republican officials, placing blame on them for limiting women's access to reproductive and emergency care. Center political leaning sources tend to highlight the shock and worry caused by the court ruling, specifically in Republican-controlled states. How interesting. This aspect is not emphasized in the other sides. And the political right emphasizes the fears of criminal prosecution following the court ruling and the potential consequences for the legality and treatment of IVF. This aspect is not mentioned in the other sides, which I think is absolutely wild. Just some things that I'm seeing here. White House spokeswoman blames Republican officials for restricting women's access to reproductive and emergency care in light of the ruling. And on the right side of things, on the political right side of things, let's see here. It says UAB's decision may impact patients trying to have babies through IVF due to fears of criminal prosecution. Now that's interesting, right? Why would there be fears of criminal prosecution, right? Why would there be fears of criminal prosecution simply for going IVF? Those of you that have been paying attention throughout this episode, I feel like should be able to connect the dots, right? If extrauterine embryos are indeed people, then that means that you would have a legal right as a healthcare system to provide medical care to these embryos, right? At the very least, you would be able to be charged for the negligence of, I would argue, the negligence of allowing another patient to be able to just walk into the cryo nursery and accidentally kill people, accidentally kill kids in the petri dishes, right? Right? Like the criminal charges, you know? You could argue that, the parents that do IVF and leave their children on ice indefinitely could be charged with, endangerment of a minor, abandonment, you know what I'm saying? It is a base expectation and requirement of parents in our society that they provide their children with, with a safe, hospitable environment, to live and be raised and all that stuff. And if you are unable to do that, the government will either incentivize you or take your kid, and there will probably be punishment for the parent. For the parent in question, right? So you can see how these things legally connect, and it's like, or logically connect. And it's like I was saying in the earlier episode a few weeks ago, where, you know, I came out as an abolitionist against abortion and kind of left my pro-life designation behind. Criminal actions against other human beings ought to be punished by law, ought to be outlawed in the law, that ought to be reflected in the laws that are on the books. Right? Capital crimes committed against human beings need to be recognized as such by the laws of the land, and guilty parties ought to be prosecuted properly, justly, fairly, but to the full extent of a just law. That to me, I think, is a very obvious biblical position. Is a very obvious position for people that would claim to be supporters of human rights, advocates for equal human rights for all. It just seems really, really obvious to me, right? But that brings me to the meat and potatoes, or I guess the potatoes. We've been covering the meat of today's episode, right? What does the scripture say? How does the scripture inform our culture of family planning? And to that end, I actually found, if it'll load for me, but an article on the Gospel Coalition, authored by Wayne Grudem in April 25th, 2019, entitled "How IVF Can Be Morally Right." All right, I'm not going to read this entire article. Like I said, I gave you the Gospel Coalition, gave you the author, gave you the title. If you want to look it up, you should be able to. You know, either on your own time, or you can look it up now on your phone, so that way you've got it with you to refer to as I talk about it in this podcast, right? And Wayne Grudem's position, again, Wayne Grudem, rather fond of the guy. I've got one of his systematic theology textbooks, either digitally or physically, in my bookshelf armory behind me here. You know, and I like a lot of the stuff he has to say, but I do disagree with him here. I do think that he is not just wrong, but quite wrong on this particular topic. And I think you know, in his opening paragraph here, in his opening section, he says that not in that paragraph. Let me see here. He mentions that as long as no human embryos are destroyed in the IVF process, then it would be okay. And the first reason he cites in defense of this is overcoming infertility is pleasing to God. And he's got quite a few things that he's quoted here. The story of Sarah and Abraham, the story of Jacob and Rachel, the story of Samson's mother, the story of Hannah, Elizabeth, and Mary. Well, not Mary, but Elizabeth, and a bunch more. And this is where my first kind of bone to pick shows itself. Not just with Wayne Grudem, but kind of with Christendom in a larger way. We got to be careful with the scriptural examples that we use, right? Like I've even got former friends. Episode for another day. But I've got some more former friends that went down this road, and yeah, they were even referencing the story of Hannah and some of these other barren women of the Old Testament to kind of justify or frame their decision to go the IVF route. But I would caution. I disagree with using the barren women of the scripture as justification. for modern alternative family creation plans, because one, you're applying all of those scriptures outside of their original context, and consequently, two, you miss the point of each. You miss the point of each, right? So just the three most common biblical ladies that I see cited to kind of justify the position of IVF and going down that road are Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah. Those are the three that I have seen most commonly. So they are the three that I will be talking about. Plus, I also believe that Hannah has a lot to say. Hannah's story has a lot to say. But, for Sarah, Sarah, formerly Sarai, wife of Abraham, had Isaac at a super old age. You know what I'm saying? She's the one that, Abraham lied and said, yeah, that this is my sister. You can have her as, that one. I would say, right, that if you're going to use Sarah's barrenness as a framing device, as a theological justification for IVF, I would politely ask you to go back and reread the story and consider it in light of the entire biblical narrative, because I would say that the barrenness of Sarah has two purposes, at least two purposes. Firstly, it highlights the activity of God through this family specifically, right? Recall that God told Abraham that he intends all the families of the earth to be blessed through his seed, right? So, you got to show the other families of the earth that God is working in this family. What better way to do that than for a barren old woman to miraculously conceive and give birth to a son, Isaac, right? And secondly, doing that safeguards the lineage of Christ from scrutiny, right? Because consider, if you will, the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, right? You can go back a few episodes in this, in this podcast history archive and listen to that message, listen to that message about the rescue mission of the world. But what we see in that genealogy is that Jesus is identified as a son of Abraham and a son of David, right? And that son of Abraham it's heavy because it brings to mind all of those promises that God gave Abraham, right? That all the family of the earth would be blessed through his seed, and Jesus is that seed, right? But if Sarah were not barren for her whole life up until her ripe old age, then how easy would it be to try to slander and discredit the genealogy of Christ, right? Well, maybe he's not really the son of Abraham. He might be the son of Sarah, but maybe he's not really the son of Abraham, right? Maybe he's this other guy's son that, that slept with Sarah before Abraham ever came along. And it's in that you see even why God was so ferociously defensive of Sarah being in bed with anybody else, in Abraham's day, right? He's got his eyes on Sarah and also on Jesus Christ, right? No, Sarah, you're not going to be sleeping around with this Egyptian king. Not only because I'm God and that's not my vision for marriage, but also because people in the future need to be able to see clearly that Jesus descends from Abraham, right? And so because of that, Sarah, you're going to be barren until Abraham, right? So again, my point is that the story of Sarah has nothing to say, yay or nay, about in vitro fertilization. It's not about that. The technology wasn't even a thought in the minds of anybody that was living back then. So it feels really weird to try and take this and apply it primarily to IVF or surrogacy, right? Which was also frowned upon by God in that story. Next up on the docket is Rachel, Jacob's wife. She found herself in a conception war. That's what I'm going to call it, a war of conception with Jacob's other wife, Leah, for Jacob's affection. and her own self-image. And because of that, she has Jacob sleep with their servant girl at least once to conceive. And she stated in the text that she believed that God had vindicated her. But the tension point is that we know from other places in the scripture that her methodology was wrong, right? Jesus is quite clear that marriage is meant to be between one man, one woman for life. You know what I'm saying? Jesus was very clear that God's intention for the sexual ethic of man was also one man, one woman for life. And Rachel is definitely going outside of all of that. And yet she thinks that God is vindicating her through her choice, through her sinful action there. And even in their own context, right? You might say, well, they didn't have the scripture. They didn't know. Yeah, but they have the example of Abraham just 1 or 2 generations ago who was rebuked by God for the same plan, right? Rachel's theology was just wrong, right? Rachel is a poor example for IVF or surrogacy or anything, right? And really, it was a theme in Jacob's life, right? It was a consistent theme in Jacob's life of limiting God, right? Even when Jacob first meets God, he limits him to the God of Bethel. He doesn't understand that God is the God of heaven and earth, right? He doesn't understand that when he first meets him. And that brings us to Hannah, right? And her story is in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. It's her story that actually opens up the record of the prophet Samuel. And I'm not going to get into why that is, because this isn't a episode studying out Samuel. But we will be landing the plane here with Hannah's story. All right. So again, for those of you that would like to follow along, I'm going to try to blitzkrieg this, but not miss the meat. 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a man, let's see here. There was a man from Ramathaim Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim. Now again, I'm reading out of the Christian Standard Bible. His name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zeph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, the first named Hannah, and the second Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. All right, so note that, right? The text describes her as childless. Verse 3, this man would go up from his town every year to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were the Lord's priests. Whenever Elkanah offered a sacrifice, he always gave portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to each of her sons and daughters, but he gave a double portion to Hannah, for he loved her, even though the Lord had kept her from conceiving. Now, I want to really point this out, right? The Lord has kept Hannah from conceiving. In this story, I'm not saying in every story, but in this story, God is credited with frustrating the pregnancy plans of Hannah. Right? It doesn't just say that her womb was shut up. It very specifically says that the Lord, all caps Lord, had kept Hannah from conceiving. In Hannah's case, it just was true. God did it. God did it, right? Verse 7, whenever she went up to the Lord's house, her rival taunted her in this way every year. Taunted her in this way every year. Hannah wept and would not eat, right? This is very clearly a sensitive topic for Hannah, seeing as she could be provoked about it. And the Hebrew words in those texts are kaas and ra'am. Kaas for vexed or angry, to be vexed or to be angry, and ra'am for to thunder, right? So the kind of anger that Hannah had whenever she would be provoked for her inability to have a child was a thunderous anger, right? A thunderous, lightningous vexation and anger, right? This isn't, right? She's not mildly upset about this, right? You mention this to Hannah, you push her button on this in just the right way, and Hannah is going off like a thunderstorm on you. That is how personal a topic this was for her, right? Verse 7 indicates that this was taking place for multiple years, right? Verse 7 literally says her rival taunted her in this way every year. And to use the phrase every year would definitely seem to suggest more than two, right? For at least more than two, it would seem to me. And it drove her to not even eat, right? Like this is proper depression, right? This is proper depression. This is proper just being wrecked about this. But verse 8 to me is very interesting, because you might say, well, Hannah's under a lot of stress as a woman of her day, under the pressure of wanting to provide an offspring, for the man of the house and all this other stuff, chauvinistic culture. Like you could say all of that, but it doesn't seem to be Hannah's situation. Because in verse 8, we get this. Hannah, why are you crying? Her husband Elkanah asked. Why won't you eat? Why are you troubled? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Right? So verse 8 indicates that this is not the first time that they have had this conversation. This is not the first time that Elkanah has had to comfort his wife Hannah over her infertility that was God-induced. By the way, God-induced infertility. I'm pretty certain they weren't aware of it necessarily, that Hannah may or may not have been aware of it at the time. But the husband literally asks, "Say, am I not better to you than 10 sons?" Right? He is not holding it against her. Right? This is personal for Hannah because it's about her. Right? This is not about her marriage. This is not about wanting to honor Elkanah, because Elkanah is not even holding it to her, right? Elkanah's not blaming her for not producing a child. He's being as gracious as he can be, right? He's leaning in. Why won't you eat? Why are you troubled? But he asks those questions even though he knows the answer. He knows that it's about Hannah's infertility. This is right. Elkanah seems to me to be a husband that's living somewhat in an understanding way, though he definitely. Again, the polygamy, not something that God endorses, but his expressions of care towards Hannah do seem here to be genuine. Verse 9, or, continuing verses 9 to 18 here, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh. Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's tabernacle. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, "Lord of hosts, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut." While she continued praying in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her lips. Hannah was praying silently, and though her lips were moving, her voice couldn't be heard. Eli thought she was drunk and scolded her. "How long are you going to be drunk? Get rid of your wine." "No, my lord," Hannah replied. "I'm a woman with a broken heart. I haven't had any wine or beer. I've been pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment." Eli responded, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the petition you've requested from him." "May your servant find favor with you," she replied. Then Hannah went on her way. And note this phrase, she ate and no longer looked despondent. Right? That's very telling. That's very telling. It was not until she vowed the boy to serve to God that she found peace enough to eat again. All right, hang that one away in your back pocket. When we get to chapter 2, we'll be talking about that one. But Hannah, in verse 22, is giving up her claim to the experiential motherhood she'd been clinging to so tightly for years before this, right? So, Elkanah and Hannah, they're intimate. They do the married person thing. Some time passes. Hannah conceives and gives birth to a son. Verse 20, she named him Samuel because she said, I requested him from the Lord. When Elkanah and all his household went up to make the annual sacrifice and his vow offering to the Lord, Hannah didn't go, and explained to her husband, after the child is weaned, I'll take him to appear in the Lord's presence and to stay there permanently, right? Which is one of the reasons why I find it so weird that Hannah's story is compared to, or is used to insinuate IVF, right? It's just not caring to talk about that particular situation. If anything, Hannah is the opposite. Hannah is the opposite of most women that go, most couples that go the IVF route, right? Because people that are going an IVF route are doing it so that they can keep the child, right? But Hannah got to a place where she gave up the child, and that makes all the difference. It makes all the difference. So skipping ahead to chapter 2, and we get Hannah's prayer. Now this is important because this is a window into the mind of Hannah. You don't get many prayer closets in the scripture. All right, so when you get one, pay attention. Pay attention, right? And so what is Hannah's prayer? 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Hannah prayed, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is lifted up by the Lord. My mouth boasts over my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. And already we're off to an interesting beat. Her mind is on the Lord and his salvation rather than on her getting her child, right? Her mind is not on the fact that she got what she prayed for. Her mind is on the salvation of the Lord. Why is that? Why is that? Right? So we keep going. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you, and there is no rock like our God. Do not boast so proudly, or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him. The bows of the warriors are broken, but the feeble are clothed with strength. Those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are starving hunger no more. The woman who is childless gives birth to 7, but the woman with many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and gives life. He sends some to Sheol and he raises others up. The Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the garbage pile. He seats them with the noblemen and gives them a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world on them. He guards the steps of his faithful ones, but the wicked perish in darkness, for a man does not prevail by his own strength. Right? She is praising God that through it all and in it all, God is working his eternal purposes out in this world. But it's interesting where she lands, right? It's interesting where she lands, right? Because again, she's not, this prayer does not sound like the usual prayer of a mother that got what she wanted, right? A mother that got what she wanted is praising God for the fruitfulness of her womb, is praising God exclusively for getting, exclusively for receiving. But Hannah is praising God not just for receiving, but also for God taking things away, right? It would seem very much that Hannah is learning a different lesson than, about IVF specifically. And the way she finishes the prayer is so messianic, right? She says, those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder in the heavens against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king. He will lift up the horn of his anointed. Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy served the Lord in the presence of Eli, the priest. All right. God gives some people a lot, and he gives some people a little. And oftentimes in life, you are going to bounce between having a lot and having a little, but it will all culminate in God, quote, giving power to his king, unquote, on the earth, right? Interesting. It's very interesting that Hannah's, that Hannah's mind state as she is dedicating the child that she has been praying for this whole time to the temple, that where she lands is on a meditation about the Messiah. Seemingly, right? Is on a meditation about the Messiah, because she mentions God giving power to his king in the context of judging the world, judging the ends of the earth, right? That's not David. That's not Saul. That's Jesus. That's Jesus. Right? Tight exegesis of the text instead of clumsy quotations of it seem to indicate that Hannah was wrestling with God, partly over whether or not to give the boy up to the office of prophet, to the work of God. Right? At least to me, that to me seems to be how it reads, right? Because again, when did Hannah's depression break? Her depression broke when she finally when she finally committed Samuel to God. And we also know, like I said, from earlier in this chapter, earlier in chapter 1, that God was the one that closed Hannah's womb. Do you think he had a purpose for the closing of Hannah's womb? Right? Right? Like Hannah clearly knew what this was, right? At the dedication of the boy being given over to service, she's meditating on Judgment Day. She's meditating on the day when the Messiah, she didn't know the name Jesus. She didn't know the name Jesus, but she knew of the Messiah. She knew of, at least from the writings of Moses, that there would be a prophet like him that would arise, right? She knew. She knew, and it seemed like God was revealing that to her in the prayer clause, and that she was initially quite resistant to the idea, right? I imagine God somehow getting across to Hannah something like this. Hannah, I'm in need of a prophet for the next chapter of building the foundation for the anointed King Jesus and his kingdom. Will you allow me to take your son in a peculiar way for this purpose? It will mean that you, unlike most other women, will not be able to be a mother in the way that you envisioned yourself being a mother. Right? And Hannah was distraught over this ask of God. She was distraught. She could not eat. She could barely sleep, it seemed. She was set off into a thunderous rage, into a thunderous anger and vexation whenever she was mocked or poked or prodded about this, right? I believe Hannah fought this burden that God had laid on her for multiple years out of a few conflicting desires. One, to be a mom and have a child. Two, to rebuke the one that was taunting her. And I think thirdly, to satisfy her image of who she believed herself to be. And I think she believed herself to be nothing if she couldn't give Elkanah a child. Right? The question that Elkanah asks Hannah is the question of Christ to us. Is the question of Christ to the woman considering IVF, to the woman that is insisting on pushing down this path. Why are you troubled? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? And it wasn't until Hannah gave up all of that in her heart that she found God's salvation, because that's the first thing she opens with, right? That she is blown away at the salvation of God, right? And that's an interesting thing to meditate on. I believe that this situation is perhaps what drew Hannah to eternal life. It very well may have been, all right? She found God's salvation because she chose the kingdom of Christ over the crown of experiencing motherhood. Now I know this is a very un-PC topic. This is not PC. This is countercultural in the extreme. But I think what we can take from Hannah's story is this, right? Consider the following, right? Consider, lady that is considering IVF, lady that is going down that road, Christian woman that is going down the road of IVF. Consider, if you haven't, consider, if it's a thought that you like to push away, that God may be closing your womb on purpose for a purpose, right? Because if we're going to compare ourselves to a biblical character like Hannah, let's be accurate, right? Right? In Hannah's specific case, God closed the womb. And that purpose God has for closing your womb may, like Hannah, be kingdom-based. And you might say to me, well, what kingdom purposes could God possibly have in closing the womb of a woman that desperately desires children? Didn't God say to be fruitful and multiply in Genesis? Why would he be against such a thing? Well, for multiple reasons, right? Because God is the one that searches out the intentions of the heart. It's very possible that God may be closing your womb for the purpose of confronting the idolatry of having kids, the idolatry of mothering that exists within your heart and needs to be dethroned if you were going to be a decent mother for him. He may be closing your womb. He may be closing your womb for the purpose of confronting the idolatry of public opinion, right? Maybe it's not so much having a kids or being a mother that really is the thing for you. Maybe it's just the thought of, well, I'm such and such years old. We've been married for such and such a time. And, wouldn't the rubes talk? What will the people talk of if they see that, I still haven't been able to conceive a child with this man that I am married to? It may be that God has closed your womb for the purpose of confronting your reluctance to adopt a kid that, quote, doesn't look like or behave like you, unquote. And to that, I simply have to say that is an anti-gospel mindset, because when God adopted us, when God adopted you for the high price of Christ's blood, we did not look like him in holiness, and we did not behave like him in righteousness. If God took your mentality towards adoption and applied it to your salvation, you would not be saved, right? If God took your mindset and applied it to how he ran the universe, right? Then you as a Christian are not here today. Because you are the problem child of heaven, right? You say that you don't want to adopt some other kid because they might be a problem child in your household. What do you think the angels might have to say about God adopting a bunch of knucklehead, rebellious heathens like us into the kingdom? It's scandalous, man. It's scandalous. And he may be closing your womb to confront the reluctance in you to allow the Spirit of God that lives in you to drive and mature you to love the people that you've deemed too broken for me and unlovable. Because that is the interesting thing about the love of God. It tends to make it very easy to love the unlovable and forgive the unforgivable. All right, I remember one call when I was still working in EMS on the ambulance that we got called out. We got called out to a kid who was an orphan with no parents, right? Young African American girl, right? And remember, we're being called out there for violence and other things, right? So I know that she's a behavioral problem, because if she wasn't a behavioral problem, I as an EMT would not have been out there. We just wouldn't have been, right? And yet, even in that short interaction, the love of God that welled up in me for her, even though I knew, I'm like, yeah, I know you're a problem child, right? You're such a problem child that the facility had to call 911 on you, and we have to take you to the hospital for an evaluation, right? That's not an easy adoption to sell to people that want their families to just look like them and run a certain way and run smoothly, right? You don't adopt that girl, right? Because she's gonna disrupt that. She would disrupt that, right? And so we certainly are not gonna go out of our way to rescue these little ones that are frozen on ice, right? Like, again, it's a question I've asked all the time, right? For Christians that are willing to go through the financial burden and shoulder that of in vitro fertilization, then why not adopt? Why not just adopt? Why do that? You can still have a family, right? And you might say, yeah, but it's not the same. But that's what I want to put my finger on. Why do you say it's not the same? Right? The Psalms declare that God puts the fatherless in homes. Do you not think that one of the ways God may put the fatherless in homes is by closing the wombs of married ladies? Right? And driving them and guiding them in the direction of adopting? Right? So that way God's word would be fulfilled that he did indeed place the fatherless in homes? In families, right? And again, I say all this to say, right, that you can't just pick and choose what scripture you want to apply, right? Because that's really what this particular thing is, right? For people that already believe IVF is good, you will find a tale in the scripture of some barren woman to justify it without actually doing the hard work of reading, without doing the hard work of exegeting the text to see what the text is and isn't clearly saying and teaching, right? But again, what I want to leave you on is, instead of going the IVF route, instead of clinging so tightly to the idea that God wouldn't want you to have any other kid but your own biological kid, meditate on the salvation of God to you, right? Meditate on that. Meditate on how the grace of God allows God to love the unlovable in us, right? And then consider that God has commanded us to love all people as we love ourselves. Then if you found yourself in a situation where your womb was closed for whatever reason, right? Why not consider adoption? Why not just do that, right? We know that God does shut the womb of women. And it's very possible that he may be shutting your womb as well to get you to understand the kingdom better, to get you to understand the importance and weight of the kingdom, to get you to understand the importance and weight of living how you live for God's kingdom purposes, not for the purpose of building your own little castles and estates down here, right? We live for a better kingdom. We live for a better king. All right? So, again, because of the extreme waste of life, because of the extreme serial murder that IVF is, right? I would say that too really ought to be abolished along with abortion, right? And if there's anyone on the political right, the so-called Christian Party of America, that's quaking in their boots at such a thing, I would advise you, like Hannah, to get a fresh appreciation of the fact that Jesus Christ one day will be setting his kingdom up on the earth. He will. He will. He will literally be doing that. And that those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. So maybe don't oppose the Lord, by engaging in a practice that is going to end with multiple human children frozen in labs somewhere indefinitely while you go off singing show tunes because you got your perfect kid. Right? How is that love? How is that love? Right? Like I said, I personally was conceived in adultery. Right? I personally was conceived in adultery. And so should my mom then say that because of what God has done and worked in my life, that adultery was okay? Right? Like that's a crazy argument. Right? But when we get into IVF and abortion and all that stuff, all of a sudden we become sinfully pragmatic and say that because the outcome looks like what I envision the kingdom to be, it must be God approved. That is not the case. That is not the case. Right? But consider. Right? Consider what the closed doors of God in your life may be trying to guide you into. Maybe trying to guide you into, right? But again, that's all I got for that. Next episode, we will be back in our verse by verse walk through the Gospel of Matthew, right? But again, I'm not releasing episodes like this just to be controversial, right? I truly believe that it's a sin. It's a dehumanization in our world. It's a commodifying of children, and believers and disciples of Jesus Christ should stand up like the church of old and say, no, children are also our equal neighbors, our equal image bearers of God. Treat them with the respect and dignity that the image of God on them demands of you. Right? And so to that end, I just want to say, hey, if this sort of content has been blessing you, has been convicting you, and has been aiding you in your pursuit of Christ, then I highly recommend that you give it a like, give the podcast a review on Spotify or on Apple Podcast. I want to give a shout out to whoever it was that gave a star rating on Spotify. I don't know who it is, but I saw the new rating, and if you're listening, I appreciate that. To the crowd that's listening on Apple Podcast, hey, somebody give a like, somebody give a review. Let's try and push this thing in the algorithm. Share it on social media, share it interpersonally. Let's get the gospel out there, and let's get you out there sharing the gospel as well, right? Be the hands and feet of Jesus to somebody this week. Whether that means that you're sharing the gospel, sharing the love of God with them, or doing something for them service-wise. Go out there and build the kingdom, guys. Go on out there and build the kingdom. And until next time, peace.